It's time for the Double Stop with Brian Sword. Welcome to the Double Stop. I'm Brian Sword. This week, I've got part one of a two-part interview with legendary session guitarist Michael Thompson. You know, it's funny because I say legendary, and that's a pretty accurate word, but he's still not a household name. So I'll rattle off a few artists he's worked with. Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Celine Dion, NSYNC, Toni Braxton, Phil Collins, Rod Stewart, Christina Aguilera, Michael Bolton, Mariah Carey, Bette Midler, Madonna, Animal Logic with Stewart, Copeland, and Stanley Clarke, and Shania Twain. And then there's the producers like Mutt Lange, Quincey Jones, Babyface, and David Foster. He was one of the main go-to guys in the LA scene for like 20 years. So in this first half, we go through his personal history. And next week, we'll talk about specific sessions. So let's jump right into it because this is a really great one. This week, I'm chatting with Michael Thompson.
I grew up on Long Island in New York, in a town called Port Washington, which is about 25 miles from New York City. And kind of like so many other musicians, you know, February 9th or whatever it was when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan was a life changer for me. I remember I got a guitar that my birthday was 2 days later, and I got a guitar, like a really lousy acoustic guitar, but it just started the whole love of wanting to do that. And you know, my brother and I had a band. We had a band called Stone Feather from like 7th grade through 12th grade. We had a number of different, you know, local musicians go through that band, but we, you know, rehearsed in my parents' garage, and we just loved it. We would rehearse in the winter with no actual heating down. We'd have like one space heater that wouldn't come close to heating the garage. And I remember the bass player at one point had mittens on and was somehow playing. But that's how much we wanted to do it, you know. And my mother would be up in the kitchen singing along with her favorite songs that we did and stuff.
So they were clearly supportive then, your folks.
Yeah, they were. My father would like drive us to, you know, we'd be in some of those battles of the bands, you know, and somehow we'd fit like all our equipment in our station wagon, you know, and my father drive us to it. And you know, so that continued through junior high school and high school for me. And then there was a local musician who was a few years older than me, who was kind of like the best drummer in town kind of thing, and we happened to know him and stuff, and he was saying, you know, he had kind of put it in my head early on that if you want to be a musician, you got to go to Berklee. You know, it was called Berklee School of Music then, not College of Music, and so I kind of had it in the back of my mind that like I got to go to Berklee, you know. And you know, when it came time to picking a college, and when I was in 12th grade, I remember sitting down with my parents, and you know, my mother was like way off base. She wanted me to go to some liberal arts college or something. And my father said, "Mike, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to go to Berklee in Boston." And he said, "Well, we'll fly up on Monday and check it out." And we did. And so he was like, you know, for being not real close to my father when I was growing up, because he was just working all the time. He was in the advertising business in New York City, and but he zoned in on that, and so that's what I did. And I spent 6 years. I went to Berklee for a couple of years, and then I got playing with a band in Boston called the Ellis Hall Group, and Ellis Hall is a legendary, like a Stevie Wonder type of blind guy that just when I got that gig in Boston, I thought I'd joined like Earth, Wind and Fire or something, because they were like the first band, kind of the only band in my life that I was ever in where there'd be like a line around the block to get in the club, you know. It was the hot local group, and so I did that for 4 years, and that was that was as much my schooling as going to Berklee, which was a great experience. But because we were doing, it was kind of like a mixed, sort of like a Sly and the Family Stone kind of thing, half originals, and then we would do covers. And the guy Ellis, he played keyboards, Hammond and clavinet and stuff in the band, but he played all the instruments, and he would have like a great little guitar part for all his tunes, and kind of like a Curtis Mayfield thing or Al McKay thing or something, and through a lot of those parts that Ellis showed me that I ended up like sort of expanding on and stuff, that was kind of like a very important schooling, and I grew up playing rock, and kind of the Long Island club band repertoire, I thought about it, it's really a great era, in the 60s, to be playing music, because bands played a full range of tunes. It wasn't like, it became like you were a rock band or you were this band, but the club bands were playing, all sorts of stuff from Sam and Dave to, like Motown tunes to rock tunes to, there was a certain kind of, you covered a lot of that stuff. So I was tuned into that sort of, I wasn't just like a one-sided rocker, but then like when I went to Boston and went to Berklee, I was intensely trying to be a jazzer out of like the year before I went to Berklee, out of the blue, I kind of, not only did I get that like you got to go to Berklee, but you got to learn how to play jazz, and so I got really interested in like a lot of guitar players did, and I kind of almost dropped totally the thing that I was good at, which was being a rocker kind of pop guy, and just it was frustrating because I went from being good at a style to being just another lame-o trying to sound like Joe Pass, but I worked hard at it. But I was so late in coming to it that when I started Berklee, I was like, I was put in some good classes because they kind of suss you out the first day, and kind of rate you and put you in with other guitar players and stuff, and so they could tell I could play and stuff, but it was frustrating because it sounded like not everyone, but like the first person I heard at Berklee day one, there was a little concert in one of the rooms, and it was John Scofield. And then it turns out like, some of the top guys that have been the top guys ever since were going or went through Berklee when I was there, like, so that was Scofield, and then Mike Stern and I became friends, and there was a lot of like two or three guitar players getting together and, playing the real book, putting up a tune and soloing on it and comping for the other guy and stuff. And while I was there, Gary Burton brought Pat Metheny to town, which was like
nice.
It was heavy, man, because it was like,
that'll humble you quick.
Humble you really quick. He was 19. And I'm actually like 6 months older than him or something, but he came there when he was 19, and I remember I had just turned 20, and I was, back then I was like so aware of like if someone was really amazing and they were 25, it's like, well, he's 25, and
I'll get there.
Yeah, but Pat came in, and I swear he had a fully realized style. He sounded then very close to how he sounded all along, but I remember he played on a Friday night at a club, and I didn't see that gig, but like by Saturday morning, word had spread about this guy Pat Metheny, and Saturday afternoon he did like a free concert out in front of this like a drum shop thing on the sidewalk, and so I went to that, and I was just dying because he sounded modern, but he had that bebop thing, and he had, he was just he was doing like what everyone in their mind wishes they were doing, that were trying to be jazzers like me and stuff, and so that was pretty major. And then he started teaching at Berklee for a short period of time, and I actually took lessons with him. They sort of had a select group of, like Mike Stern and me and Jeff Richmond, a handful of guys studied with Pat, quote unquote, which was a really humiliating experience for me because the lesson consisted of, and I've told this story a million times, but it's a good one. It's like Pat would sit in this little room, and he had this Standell amp, and like one channel had reverb, and one channel was bone dry, and guess which channel you got? So right off the bat, he had the reverb, and and he'd put up a tune that he had been just shredding on all day long. I mean, like with a bunch of changes and stuff, and you'd comp for him, but ting, 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 and he'd be just like blowing. Then it was your turn, and so it was like really intimidating, like just that whole process, and I remember taking a solo and after him and then just sort of stopping after like one time around or two times around. He said, "Yeah, you were going pretty good till you started playing those octaves, and that sounded really stupid. Don't do that, or something." I'm like, "Oh man," and so that studying with Pat Metheny thing didn't last very long because he only did it for like a few months or something. But after Berklee, he came down and saw me play a couple of years later with that band, the Ellis Hall group that I was telling you about. And I was into my element then. I was being good. I was soloing and comping and I had come into my own a little bit. I mean, guys were coming down to see me play and stuff like that, so I wasn't just like another guy at Berklee trying to play jazz, but and he was like really complimentary and stuff. So it was kind of sweet vindication or whatever, like a couple of years after Berklee that Pat did get a chance to see me play. I don't know how I got off on this Pat Metheny tangent, but that was, early years and kind of getting the style together and all the elements that go into it. And I've been really glad throughout my career that I dove so deeply into I say trying to be a jazzer, but I absorbed quite a bit because I've had to play not out and out jazz, but a lot of jazzy stuff, and I know what it's supposed to sound like. I know like the right touch and the right tone and stuff. So I've been able to handle that kind of thing better than just, I sort of faked it kind of thing. I know what it's about and stuff, and I love it, and it's just something that my personal style, it's like I would never do a jazz gig and get up and try and blow bebop or something,
Well, sure, but I would imagine having the cover band background and then the jazz and the improvising that goes along with jazz has really served you well as you move through your career.
Yeah, that's the big thing, that the improvising thing, and a lot of the lines and the whole approach and mentality and stuff that you absorb when you're delving into jazz. It's like, yeah, that carries over big time in general. You may have a rock sound and that approach, but in my mind, I guess, there were so many influential, and I spent so long listening to not just straight ahead jazz, but all the fusion stuff that came in the 70s, back when fusion, Mahavishnu and Billy Cobham and Stanley Clarke, those records, I wore them out, and to this day when you jam it on my own gigs and stuff, I've done some of those old staples from like Billy Cobham's Spectrum album and stuff, and so I really got I kind of got the fusion, the jazz rock fusion thing. Remember I saw Mahavishnu really early on, like I think it was their second gig or something. They were actually opening. I was there to see the Steve Miller Band. I was there to see Steve Miller It was at
And they were opening?
Yeah, the Beacon Theater in New York. It might have, it was probably 72. And, that was the thing back then, that they would have those great, I went to the Fillmore East quite a bit, and Bill Graham would just have the best, like totally eclectic bills. Like, I saw Albert King, it'd be like Albert King, Procol Harum, and The Who or something, or like, a lot of the time, I remember one show I saw was Jeff Beck, 10 years after, and then like the headliner a lot of the time would be some big San Francisco band like Country Joe and the Fish, or like Canned Heat or something like that. And like the last train out to Long Island, the Long Island Railroad went from New York City right back to my town, was the end of one of the lines, and like to get the last train, you'd have to bail on the last band anyway. But I didn't dig those San Francisco bands, most of them, except for like Santana, when they came out and stuff. But I like Country Joe and Canned Heat, and I liked Janis Joplin's later band, but I didn't like whatever that first band she had was and stuff. And so a lot of the times at the Fillmore East, they would be the headliner. But all that to say that I was exposed to some stuff there, especially the blues acts that I caught that I would have never seen, on my own.
And of course, you're absorbing all of it.
Yeah. I mean, you're getting the real deal, and I also got a chance to see, like, Zeppelin, on their second tour. There was in Central Park, they used to do these great concerts that were like, it was like $2 a ticket, and then like $1 for the seats that were way in the back or something. I mean, the Fillmore East was $3, $4, and $5. $5 were the really expensive seats, and every now and then I'd splurge and go for the $5 ticket, And when you think about those kind of prices to see music, I mean, even with the adjustment of what money's worth and stuff, it's pretty great, and it was such a great time to grow up in that era. I mean, I went to Woodstock. My brother and I rode our bikes into Woodstock from like where the traffic started, and my mother, like, we were about a couple of hours away from Woodstock, and originally, like, family, because they started advertising in like January or something, and we bought tickets to Woodstock. I still have the poster in my studio that you got when you bought tickets. They sent you one of those original Woodstock posters, which actually have a couple of bands listed that never ended up playing there. Yeah, it's probably worth some money or something. But that was a really that was a really amazing experience. I was 15, and I think my brother and I were the only ones there that weren't high, But the music, I mean, it's still, I've seen the Woodstock movie so many times, and that just sort of reconfirms it. But it just sticks out in my mind. It's just like one of those. It sounded amazing, and it was just some great performances, and anyway.
So let's jump back to Ellis Hall. So how long did you play with that group, and then how did you transition to the recording side, or when did you start that transition?
Well, that was I played with them for 4 years, and we played like every week, like Wednesday through Sunday. We had a manager, like a management company, and they kept us booked, and we would play at like, there was a club circuit, and especially a college circuit in New England, and like prep schools and colleges, and in the winter there was like a place up in Stowe, Vermont, that we'd play like a ski club kind of thing, and we stayed busy. I didn't make much money. I made somehow barely enough to live on, but for 4 years, so it wasn't like on and off. It was like 4 years gigging 4 to 5 nights a week. But you said what was the other part?
Well, in terms of transitioning into the studio, how did you make that move?
Yeah, the other cool thing about being in that band was that the manager was hooked up with this local studio in Boston called Music Designers that was like a cool studio, and the head engineer guy there liked the band, and we did a whole project up there. I mean, today we would have just done the album that we did and released it, and probably we could have probably sold 10,000 albums with, the New England fans and stuff that we had, but we held out and tried, the management wanted to get the big LA record deal in the sky kind of thing. And so we didn't release that first album, but we ended up getting a record deal with CBS with this guy Norman Connors, who had some success with his own albums, and he had gotten like a four project deal or something, and he flew back there and saw us and signed the band. And we basically, I had been knowing I was going to move to LA regardless of what the band did, and so we basically came out to LA and re-recorded the same stuff that we had done in Boston, but out here with that other producer, and it was okay, but it didn't come out as good. And but that first record we did in Boston was really hip because we had it was really funky stuff, and the Brecker brothers, the studio owner knew them, and they were in town for the weekend playing at this place called the Jazz Workshop, and so they paid Mike and Randy like cash, and I think blow too or something, and they came by the studio, and like one guy took 5 tunes, the other guy took 5 tunes, and wrote charts, great Brecker brother horn charts to our tunes. One of the songs I wrote, and that song still sounds great to me. But so, and then Tom Scott did a solo on one tune because that the studio guys knew him too, and so we had this really good album, but it just didn't. Like I said, if it was today, we would have just released it. But so that one never got released. But that was cool because it was recording experience that I got, and I loved the studio. I kind of got a chance early on, even before that, with my band I had in high school. My father, one of his accounts was RCA Records, and he took our demo tape over there, and one of their A&R guys, one of the lower A&R guys, really liked the tunes. We had a really good guy in the band, that local guy in our town, but he was a really good songwriter and player and everything. He's kind of my mentor as a lead guitar player. But so this guy liked our songs and wanted to do something with us, and so he started bringing us in like on weekends into New York City, into like RCA Studio C, the big top studio. And I was 16, and so I got a taste of that, like this is a real recording studio, we're recording kind of thing, and I loved it, I really dug it. And so then in Boston, getting a chance to record with Ellis and do overdubs and stuff like that, it was something I knew I wanted to do it. Plus I always just loved, great guitar parts on records and hooky pop, parts I had to learn, parts that I wanted to learn, certain records, just like tearing them apart, figuring out the thing, and just there was a certain mystical, magic to like a guitar part on a hit record that just, why does it work? Why does it sound so good? That kind of thing. And so I was attracted to it early on. I didn't, some guys, fall into it by way of one thing or another, but I was definitely shooting for that early on, and wanting to move to LA and knowing that was the center of the recording world. Plus, I had been out here when I was a teenager on vacation with my parents, and I just you know, I was 15. I think it was the same summer as Woodstock, and I went, this is me. We were staying in Santa Monica for a couple of weeks, and I went, I'm going to move here someday.
So now your mid-20s, maybe late 20s, Ellis Hall Group record doesn't come out. You're now in LA. So what moves did you want to make?
I coordinated moving out here. I mean, it just so happened that band got a record deal on CBS, and I was able to move out here. And I mean, at the time, I was like, well, I'll live out here, and when we go on tour, you know, I'll just be with the band. And of course, that didn't work out. But the first couple of weeks I was out here, I got to record and get like scale or whatever. You know, I had to join the union right away, but it was great to have that when I first moved out, and you know, and but that was 79. I was 25, I guess. And like one of the first things that struck me was like, man, I should have moved out here 5 years ago, you know, that kind of thing. Because I felt like I was definitely coming from behind with I mean, it basically, you know, took the better part of the 80s for me to go from zero to the point where I was in the conversation with, like, you know, where I got a chance to be one of the cats, you know. It wasn't like I did nothing for 10 years and then all of a sudden every year got better, but I mean, I literally started at ground zero, you know, and
without a network of people that you knew.
Yeah, I mean, I had to start with from real scratch and playing, you know, every demo in favor and this $35 session and, you know, that kind of thing. And you know, and I remember there was a studio keyboard player that I had worked with early on, this guy named Brian Mann. I don't know whatever happened to him, but I remember him saying, you know, it could take like 6 or 7 years to break in to the scene. And I was like, 6 or 7 years? You know, I was so gung-ho that I was ready. I felt like I was ready then, but, you know, everything happens when it's supposed to. I'm a big believer in that your life's path is already written and stuff. But I could have somehow started at, like, a guy I knew at Berkeley was J.R. John Robinson, you know, who was playing on every hit all through the 80s. And when I got out here, he had just done like Michael Jackson's Off the Wall album or something, and I called him and he's like, yeah, well, you know I've gotten better, but I'd have to hear you again before I recommend you. and I'm like, whoa, man, that's cold. And we ended up being, you know, on a million dates together and in bands together and stuff like that. But that was like one of the only people I knew when I moved out here, and I went, okay, that's not going to be any help, you know. And and I've never been a big like, you know, now with Facebook and everything, people are just plugging themselves all over the place. But I wasn't like go out to the clubs and sit in and, you know, I was kind of waiting for someone to call me, you know, kind of thing. But so I was never a big like self-promoter kind of guy. But I did little by little get a chance to show what I could do, and we're getting around. And you know, the first year right when I got out here in '79, there was a guy from Boston, a guy named Jim Lange that had gotten a gig with Joe Cocker because Joe needed a band. He had this one band for like a few years, and they got a record deal, and so like he needed a new band, and Jim had gotten the gig, and I was like, man, get me an audition, and so I flukily got a gig with Joe Cocker like the week I got out here, but of all the years that he toured relentlessly, that didn't turn out to be one of them. It was like I did a 3-week tour of Europe, which was great. I had never been, out of the country or anything, and it was actually called Woodstock in Europe. 10 years later, it was 79, and it was like Joe was the top billed thing, and then it was like Country Joe. Speaking of Country Joe, Richie Havens, and a couple of smaller acts. And Joe's manager at the time was that guy Mike Lange, that curly-haired guy that put on Woodstock, the Woodstock Festival. And so anyway, that was real big time for me, really big time, to be playing Help from My Friends with Joe Cocker on stage in front of 10,000 people. Because it was all those European outdoor festival kind of things. And so that was a huge thrill. But then we came back to town, that was a 3-week tour and stuff, and he was supposed to go out the next month, and he decided to not tour. I think he was, drying out or something like that, and so my wife and I, who we're still together, we've been together 38 years, my wife Gloria, we were such newbies and novices at the whole thing. I mean, in Boston, I had that gig with Ellis for 4 years, and we just scraped by. But we came out here, and it was like the cruel reality of life set in, And I mean cruel, like in Boston, you never even knew who your landlord was or something. I remember we were like 2 months late with our rent in Boston when we left, and came out here, and we're like, scraping first few months every month to pay, because I promptly spent the Joe Cocker money, and my father had lent us some money to move out here and stuff, and we just went through it thinking like, oh, I got a gig, so now I'm cool, and it wasn't, and I remember we were like, I don't know, 3 days late with our rent or 5 days late with our rent, but we came back to this little apartment that we actually ended up living there for 9 years, but there was an eviction notice on the door, and it was like, oh my God, So I had to go out to the landlord guy's office and practically beg him on my knees to not throw us out, and so from then on we were hip to you got to pay your rent on time or you get kicked out. So it was like a real welcome to the real world thing, moving out here. I know, I mean, I've always, advised, people that are coming out to save a bunch of money or, be able to float for months or whatever, or get a day gig or something, because it's just, that's where it's at. You could fall into something quickly, but the chances of that weren't great. But so it was a real, but I was just so hungry and so full of just the, fire that you have to be filled with to come into a situation like moving to LA and trying to make it as a studio guy. When I think about the logistics of that, it's like, well, God, he had me sort of like, okay, man, we're going to let you do that. That's your life's, ambition, and damned if I didn't get to do that. But, moving way, way, way forward to now, there isn't even a scene to break into. But when I moved here, and for 25, 30 years, there was a thriving, record business, session business, producers hiring session musicians, to break into, to aspire to, be part of. So there was something there. It was just getting to be, where you were, where was your number that was called? It was,
top of the list instead of the bottom.
Yeah, or even on the list.
Yeah. You said basically grinding it out through the 80s When does the Michael Thompson band come into play then?
Actually, I don't know if Wynn didn't mention it in his interview, but I started working down at Total Access, Wynn Davis's studio, in like '82. So from the Joe Cocker thing, I ended up doing one other short little tour with him, but then reality set in, and it's like, wow, I got to get a job, and I'd never had a job, So I looked in the paper, and there was a thing saying drivers needed for this cab company. And so for a year, I ended up driving a cab for this horrible, like, local city cab was the name. It's actually in Culver City where I live now, but it kept us alive. But while I was doing that cab gig, I had met this guy named Tony Berg. It's interesting the way the circles of people, the 6 degrees of this guy and 6 degrees of that guy, intertwine. There was a bass player that did the Joe Cocker gig, a guy named Trey Thompson. And when we came back from that gig, I started teaching his girlfriend guitar, and her sister was girlfriends with this guy named Tony Berg, who was like, he was kind of like a connected Hollywood kid. His father was a big TV producer, and he had a band called Romance, and this girl Suki that I was teaching told Tony, man, you got to check out this guy Michael Thompson, and so he came over to my apartment and he played me some of the band stuff, and it was really good tunes and really good production and stuff, and they were looking for a guitar player, and so I ended up joining that band, and there was a drummer named Art Wood, really good drummer, who was really busy doing sessions and gigs and stuff, and so I did that band for like a year, and then Art ended up getting a gig with Cher. She was auditioning, she had a band for a few years and ended up, doing a big cattle call audition thing, and needed, pretty much a new band. And so Art had gotten a gig, and again, I said, get me an audition. So he recommended me for an audition, and it was really, I don't think they even have auditions like that anymore, but I mean, everyone had been recommended and stuff, but 75 guitar players auditioned. And there was a line, the first audition wasn't even for Cher, it was like for her MD, this guy named Gary Scott. And it was at an SIR that was on Santa Monica. And I remember, like, there was a line coming out the door, and every guy had like his guitar and a little amp, and someone would audition, and then you would move up like a slot on the sidewalk, and then you moved into the building and you got closer. Then you could start hearing them, and they were literally, I think they were auditioning on 2 tunes, and the what they wanted was a rocker that could read. That was the thingy, because it was like mostly Vegas, even though I got to go to Australia and South Africa and Europe and stuff, a bunch of places with her. Most of it was like Caesar's Palace, and it was a show, and so the reading thing was like, she wanted a long hair rocker guy, but you had to be able to read charts and stuff, and so I had to get out of that cab, and there was no way I wasn't going to get that gig. So I had gotten my friend Art, who was, had gotten the gig on drums, to bring the charts that they were auditioning on home, like the day before my audition. And I went over to Art's and just like made him play the stuff over and over with me. I remember it was that song Fame and another song from Fame. I think it was Out Here on My Own or something like that. Those were the two, that was the hot thing in Fame, the movie, and so that's what I did. And so, and plus I could follow charts, and I was never a great sight reader or anything, but it wasn't total foreign thing to me. But
Sure.
man,
But
I want
cheated.
to come into that. What?
So you basically cheated.
Oh shit! Yeah, I mean, there was no way.
Whatever it takes.
Like I said, I was so hungry, and I was so wanting to get out of that cab and get a gig, get a real gig, you know. So at the audition, I remember coming in when I could finally see in the room, you know, and I was there, and like I saw a couple of guys auditioning before me, and I remember one guy, I had seen him play before, and he was a really good rock player and stuff, but he couldn't read to save his life, and so he sort of, you know, fell all over himself, you know, trying to get through this chart, and so I got up there, and but I took one look at this musical director guy, and I mean, I've been wrong so many times about people, and this was a perfect case of like looking at the guy going, that guy's not going to like me. I don't like the way he looked. I mean, he actually, he looked like a rabbi, Gary Scott. You know, he had this beard, and you know, he ended up being one of my main music connections through the 80s into the 90s, movies, TV shows. Great guy, but it was sort of that first impression thing where I thought, you know. And so I went up and I played the two tunes, and he came over to me right away and he said, I can definitely tell you you're one of the guys we're going to call back, right? So so that was big. And so like 3 days later or something, you did your audition for Cher, and it was in this big rehearsal room, huge rehearsal room at SIR that's no longer there anymore. And she was sitting on a couch, and about 50 feet away they had like a gear set up, and the audition consisted of the song Fame. You would play one verse, one chorus, and a solo, and stop. That was your audition. And so, you know, I heard the guy, there were 3 guys that they called back out of the 75, you know, and I heard the guy before me, and he was trying to throw like everything he ever learned into that one verse, one chorus and stuff. And I went, you know, I'm going to just take the you know, solid comp kind of route, and then take a solo, you know, good rock solo or whatever.
And was it your
and so
solo?
Anyway, what's that?
Was it your solo? Did you write the solo, or was it something that was already charted?
Yeah, you could do your own solo. It was like over E minor or something like that. You know, it had that line in it, and and so anyway, you know, when I got home, the manager called me and said, "Hey, you got the gig. Cher liked you," and you know, it was also about looks and stuff like that.
Sure,
too.
it always is something like that.
So that got me out of the cab. Literally 2 weeks later, I was sitting in Monte Carlo at a table, wining and dining with Cher, and I had been like 2 weeks earlier. I had been like, you know, can I get your bag, sir?
Well, you know, you got to pay your dues so you can appreciate it when you're there.
And I started that whole giant tangent to say how I started working at Wynn Davis's studio. That guy, Art Wood, who was the drummer of Romance and the drummer who got me the Cher audition, had a project, and he knew Wynn, and he brought it down there, and, you know, he got me on it playing guitar, and that's how I met Wynn. And we hit it off, and through that little sort of growing circle of people that I met doing Cher's band, you know, guys were pulling guys in on little projects they were involved in and stuff, and you know, that actually, I say the 6 degrees of, there was a bass player named Bob Parr, who was Cher's bass player, who to this day we're still friends and stuff, but he really liked how I played, and he was like really involved in the Christian music world, you know, and he pulled me into that, and it ended up being a lot of work, a lot of sessions, and through that there was another guy that Wynn uses a lot over the years and stuff, a guy named John Schreiner, a keyboard player, who was also involved producing a lot of Christian stuff, and he, you know, pulled me in on that and stuff. I mean, it wasn't huge money or anything like that, but it was a bunch of work, and it was like the 6 Degrees thing with that Bob Parr guy was like, he wanted at one point in the, when was it? It was like 88. He wanted to use the engineer that David Foster used. So I've been working with Bob for about 5 years or something at that point. And so this guy, Woody Woodruff, who David had been using in the, 80s as his engineer, this guy, Bob Parr, got on a session because he wanted to use David Foster's engineer, And so we did a session. It was just for someone's tune or something. And a couple of days later, I got a call from Woody, and he was up at David's, and he said, "Hey, Michael, David needs a guitar player." And that was my first opportunity to work with David. Totally fluky. It was like never forget driving up to Malibu thinking, damn, David Foster, like, what is this going to be like, And I got there, and there were like five guys who I still, a guy named Chris Earthy, who's been David's longtime, sort of right-hand man and assistant. I mean, Chris lives up in your city, and but he used to live in L.A. And another guy named Dave Reitzes, who ended up being a big engineer and stuff. But I came in, and like David wasn't in the room yet, and he was. Then he made like a grand entrance, and and the actual session was like a demo favor for Paul Anka.
Oh, wow.
Another Canadian who
yeah.
I to this day still do. I became like an arranger for Paul Anka.
Really?
By way of like doing sessions for him, in the early 90s to like in the mid 90s, him calling me wanting to have me do tracks, because he's always sort of used enhancement. He has a great band and everything, but he was kind of early on using enhancement tracks live,
Oh, right.
And I'll never forget the first gig that he called me to do, on the track thing, not just playing on one of his sessions, was he was using this loop of ZZ Top Legs, that thing.
Yeah.
And and like the Sex Pistols had done My Way, and so like he was doing this quirky like version of My Way live that he wanted. He basically wanted that ZZ Top Legs sequencer sound to follow the changes of My Way. And so, because they just had the static, now the time has come, and the idea was cool, but he needed something to actually follow the changes. So that was the first thing he called me. I remember him calling, and he goes, "You can do that, right? You know how to do that, right?" And I was like, yeah, I can do it, and I didn't have a clue how you did it, Now there's a whole bunch of stuff that does the sequencery thing. But I remember calling my friend John Jones, another Canadian musician, and said, man, who was kind of hip to all things technical like that. I said, man, how do you do that thing where you trigger the thing? And he hit me to this gate technique where you feed a hi-hat off a drum machine into this DBX gate thing, and then you plug your guitar into it, and it goes, jabba, 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 jabba. You have to, whatever the hi-hat's playing, you get that rhythm. So that first gig that Paul called me with, I came out a winner, and I ended up nailing what he wanted me to do on that thing. And that started like 20 years of, I went from doing tracks to enhance, already arranged tunes to like becoming one of Paul Anka's arrangers, right up there with frickin' Nelson Riddle and Don Costa. And it's like about half of his show to this day, I've I'm the arranger on the
Wow.
Yeah, it's really wacky. It's like who would have ever thought? But and a weird like circle is that my guitar teacher, when I was 12, I studied with this guy for 6 years, actually, a guy named Danny Perry, and he was Paul Anka's guitar player, and back in the in the 60s, like in Paul's house, he had a picture of Paul at the Copa singing with this guy Danny Perry sitting behind him with a jazz guitar, like playing and stuff. And so Paul always dug that connection that Danny Perry was my guitar teacher, and here I was, 30 years later or whatever, working with him. But so that turned into a real educational thing for me too. He liked these arrangements that I'd come up with, and I would do tracks, and then the band, they mix it in with the live thing, and so you're hearing, he only has one guitarist, but on a lot of tunes you're hearing multiple guitar parts.
Sure.
And stuff. Anyway, so I'm just throwing a lot of stuff out there.
This is great. This is great.
Yeah, the Paul Anka thing. I mean, and I just did. And now these days, it's like I may not hear from him for a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. I actually worked my way up to producing. I did 6 tunes for his last album was on Sony, and it was a duets album, and but it wasn't just like let me do all the work and then someone else take the credit. I said, Paul, can I get like produced and arranged by? And he said, you know what? Yeah, you've earned it, kind of thing,
After all these years,
he kind of dug that. But it actually says produced and arranged by Michael Thompson.
Oh yeah.
I did most of it in my little studio, including his vocals.
Wow.
Yeah, and the other studio that he used was Capitol Studio A. So it was like my tiny little room and Capitol A.
The Michael Thompson Band. Can you tell me how that came together?
Which is what you were trying to get to a long time ago. You didn't want to hear anything about Paul Anka.
You know what? I love it. That's great stuff.
Well, I'm emphasizing all of it. I feel like I'm... it's funny because my mother, who's 87, just found out like a few years ago when she was doing something with her license or something, that all these years she's had dual citizenship. She was born in Canada, and when she was 1, she moved to actually the town where I grew up, Port Washington. But she's held like Canadian citizenship, dual citizenship her whole life, and
wow.
She didn't know it, So I'm technically half Canadian.
Oh, there you go. Well, my wife's a dual. She's half American.
Yeah. So. Cool. So anyway, geez, man, I got off on a tangent. I started out to say that I met Wynn through Art Wood, doing those projects, and we did. A couple of people I was working with ended up working down at Total Access a bunch, and so I got to know him a little bit. And I'll never forget, we were doing someone's project or something, and Quiet Riot had just hit, and they were the biggest thing out, you know. And Wynn turned to me and he said, man, we could do that, Mike. Why don't you write a couple of tunes, and I'll produce it, and we'll come in here and record the tunes, and we'll do a project. And that was so huge to me because, it wasn't like everyone and their mother had their own studio like it is today. It was a great studio with a great engineer, and he was offering his time and studio. And so that was a giant light bulb that went off, and I called a guy that I had met, a guy named Jeff Lieb, who calls himself Jeff Paris. And I knew he was a really good songwriter. He was like signed to Almo Irving, and we had done a little like rock band thing, doing like Foreigner tunes and stuff. And he could sing. He could sing his ass off, and he was a good writer. And we were really into the '80s Def Leppard. This was before like Hysteria, that
the Pyromania,
that sound,
yeah,
right, Pyromania. That was the vibe that we were trying to emulate. And so when Wynn said that, I got together with Jeff and wrote these first 4 tunes that became like my project, and originally Jeff was going to be the singer, and so we wrote the 4 tunes, and we went down to Wynn's, and we laid them down with a couple of different drummers, and Jeff was going to be the singer, and then he ended up getting offered a solo deal with MCA, which he ended up putting out 2 albums that are kind of like the MTV album. They're kind of revered by those Euro, melodic rock people that kind of, follow that music. And Jeff, and then Jeff had some success. He co-wrote, or he wrote a good, one of the Mr. Big hits, and he sort of became the guy that like co-wrote a bunch of tunes with different bands like Y&T and all these bands that were, wanting needing tunes but writing with a good writer kind of thing. And so anyway, but that got me going down at Wynn's, and we had this project, and we had these tracks, and they were good. It was a good 4 tunes. They were catchy and hooky, and Jeff, he's a good writer and stuff, and we had Jeff's scratch vocal on tape, but he was no longer available to do it. So this manager guy named Stephen Brooks, who would co-manage Missing Persons, Wynn's connection with Ken Scott, and Missing Persons and Terry Bozzio, this guy Stephen Brooks was co-manager of that, and then he heard my stuff and he liked it and wanted to, manage the project and stuff, and so he started getting guys to come down and audition from like just local bands, someone he saw at the Troubadour, or this band, or this guy he'd heard about. And so we had like a sort of a parade of singers come in and try to sing along with these tracks, but Jeff wrote it up in the register that, the Lou Gramm, Steve Perry territory, which, most guys just, I remember a couple of them heard it and went, well, I can tell you right now I can't sing that, and then one fortuitous night, this guy Billy Trudell came in, and he was this enthusiastic, big, tall guy with bushy hair and shit, and he was in a band, like a Valley band called Laser or something, and Stephen Brooks had seen them at the country club or something like that. And Billy came in and just, he heard like one verse and he said, great. And he's another guy that, I'm still, real talented guy, sounds like $1 million on tape, live. He ended up singing with Elton John for a bunch of years in the late 90s, early 2000s and stuff, and did a lot of studio work and stuff, but this was the green, like, 23-year-old kid. He went out in the studio, and we could tell that he, could hit the notes, and he had a good-sounding voice and stuff. It was really rough and stuff, so he got the gig, and he became the singer for that project, and for the next few years we worked on, it was called Slang was the name of the band, and we worked on tunes, and Wynn was right there, when we'd write a new tune.
Okay, folks, that's all the time we have for this week. We'll continue the conversation next week. And remember, for all things Double Stop, please visit thedoubletop.com. I'm Brian Sword. Thanks for listening.